Let me move on to the Supreme Court battle over the legal definition of a woman. Women have, endured years of abuse and sackings, even assaults for taking on your government's policies. Will you now apologise to them now that they've been vindicated?
I think what's important is that in any answer I give on this question, I start by accepting the outcome of the Supreme Court judgment. And I do that because I believe in the rule of law.
Which feminists have always said was the case. So they've been vindicated. The Supreme Court has upheld what they've always said, and that you have not listened to them, they would say.
Well, there's a couple of things about that, Graham. The first thing is that on two previous occasions, courts in Scotland supported the position that was taken forward by the Scottish Government in relation to the gender balance on public boards, which was the issue the Supreme Court took a different view about. So I think it's important to recognise that this issue has been considered extensively by courts, and on two occasions, Scottish courts supported the Scottish Government's interpretation of competing pieces.
And now we have the ultimate judgments.
And my first answer to you was to accept that ultimate judgment.
But do you accept any responsibility for the mess and confusion over gender policy over the past few years?
We've been navigating our way, as the Supreme Court have narrated in their judgment, through competing pieces of Westminster legislation, and the Supreme Court has given the final word on the matter, and the Scottish Government accepts that. We will get on with addressing the implications of that judgment, and we'll do that by taking advice from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. We'll do that by setting out our approach that's going to be taken to Parliament, and we'll take that forward by the actions that will require all public bodies to operate.
So if you accept the Supreme Court ruling, as you say, from that, can we take it you accept a trans woman is not a woman?
Well, I accept the Supreme Court ruling that a woman is defined by biological sex.
You accept it, but do you agree with it?
Well, I accept the ruling. I accept the rule of law. That's what the court...
What's your view?
Well, that's my view. That's what I've said.
No, that's not your view. That's you accepting a reality. I'm asking you, do you accept a trans woman is not a woman?
Well, that's the answer I'm giving you. I'm responding to your question by accepting the Supreme Court ruling and defining that and accepting the definition that's been put in place.
And to be fair, I mean, you have consistently refused to answer that question directly in interviews. So let me ask you instead, why do you find it so difficult to answer the question?
I want to make sure that I am operating within the rule of law, which is why my answer has been given to you in the way that it's been given to you. And secondly, that I acknowledge the fact that there will be enormous anxiety being felt by people in the trans community just now. And I want to make sure that they are reassured that the points contained in the Supreme Court judgment, which are about the protection of the rights of the trans community, lie at the heart of the response.
Yeah, because of course that question is a trans woman, a woman. It's not just an academic question. There are now implications for public sector organisations. I wonder what you think has changed as a result of the court's decision.
I think the court's decision provides a clarity that wasn't in existence before, and then as a consequence of that, we have to explore and take forward the necessary guidance to public bodies that will enable public bodies to operate consistent with the Supreme Court ruling.
Are you going to provide a lead?
And of course, in that respect, we will engage with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who are the regulator on these issues in terms of the Equality Act 2010. As a consequence of that, we will develop the guidance that is necessary to support organisations in coming to these issues.
If you look at the legislation that led to this court case, the law which introduced a target of 50% female representation on the boards of public authorities. Now, previously, that included people who were not biologically female. But what does it mean now? I mean, does a trans woman not count towards that 50%? Are they counted as a man now?
My interpretation of the Supreme Court judgment is that they would not be contained. They would not be considered as part of that target. So that was the sharp point on which the Supreme Court was coming to a judgment.
So let's take it down to a sort of a lower level. If you're a janitor in a school or a college, who do you let into the female toilets? Do only biological women and girls count? And how do you decide who is a biological woman?
Well, I think these issues are now the issue of further discussion and dialogue that will be the source that will be developed as part of the guidance that has got to be brought forward. And there will be detailed consideration given to the implications of these issues, along with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission.
Let's take a look at the other side of this. Many trans people are feeling scared right now because they see their opponents as having scored a victory in a political climate which is turning against them, both here at home and in the US. And they're looking to the SNP, which Nicola Sturgeon once described as their party. And they see a First Minister that just wants to sweep the gender issue under the carpet and move on. Why won't you stand up for them?
I think if you looked at what I said on Wednesday when the ruling came out, I made it absolutely crystal clear that I wanted to protect the rights of everybody. And that's underpinned my entire approach as being First Minister. And indeed, the BBC was running a headline yesterday which acknowledged my concern about anxiety within the trans community with the implications of the Supreme Court judgment. So I'm not quite sure where the basis of your question.
Well, let me give you an example then. Would you call on the UK government to update the 2010 Equality Act and allow people with a gender recognition certificate to be recognised for their chosen gender? Because this is ultimately a political question.
It is, and obviously there's got to be a lot of reflection in the aftermath of the judgment, because the Supreme Court has set out the basis of the interpretation of the two pieces of legislation that were in dispute. So that question has got to be wrestled with,
and politicians can change that.
And to go back to what I've said to you throughout this interview, I'm interested in bringing around about cohesive communities. I'm interested in bringing people together. I am interested in doing what the Supreme Court judgment said is the case.
Yeah, but the problem with that,
of making sure that this is not perceived to be a victory by one side or the other.
Sure, but the problem with that, the problem with accepting the Supreme Court verdict, as far as a lot of trans people are concerned, as they say, it's now impossible to be recognised for who they are, for their chosen gender, something that was backed by the European Court of Human Rights. Politicians, if you're saying that you're with trans people, you have to back them up in legislation, don't you?
And the legislation that you're referring to is legislation that is brought forward by the Westminster Parliament, and it will be for us to, and we've requested engagement with the UK government to take forward many of these questions.
But what about your legislation, which was to allow trans people to self-identify? Why can't you bring back that legislation? Because actually, you know, you could say there's no danger in doing that now, as opponents would say, because obviously the Supreme Court has come to its judgment. You could allow people to self-ID without any great harm.
What we've got to make sure is that we have a strong basis for taking forward our legislation, and the gender recognition legislation that the government brought forward has been thwarted by the courts, and we are unable to take that forward.
Everything's changed now, though. That is possible to bring that forward, isn't it?
Well, the Scottish Government has got to consider the implications of the ruling that has been given by the Supreme Court. We'll give a statement to Parliament on Wednesday to determine how, to set out how the government will progress on these issues, and to determine the steps that we take. But fundamentally for me, it is important that we act to protect the rights of all within our society. That was what the Supreme Court ruling indicated was the case. There are the trans community have established legal rights, and I want to make sure that those legal rights are protected and asserted.
And do you think it's right that a trans person has, you know, to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria and prove that they've been living as their acquired gender for 2 years? Is that acceptable?
Well, that's the current legal position, because it hasn't been changed by any of the legislation.
Well, what's your view? You're a politician. You're a policymaker.
And I supported that legislation, and I was pleased to support that legislation.
Do you still support it?
Because I wanted to make sure that the lives of trans people were made better as a
That's the
consequence of the
past. Do you still
legislation being brought
support it,
forward.
or do you regret supporting it now?
Well, I don't regret supporting the legislation, no, but we've now got to reflect on the situation that we find ourselves in as a consequence of the ruling which came from the Supreme Court on Wednesday.
First Minister John Swinney, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme.